Well, welcome everyone to this session of our Winter Tales Festival of Literature, Religion, and the Imagination. Is there a bit of a reverberation? Okay. I'm Stuart J. Brown. I'm professor of ecclesiastical history here at the University of Edinburgh, and it's my great honor to be chairing the session in which we were to have two leading authors, Sara Maitland and Kate McLoughlin, to discuss their recent works, their recent books, their recent research, including the theme of silence. Now, Sara Maitland was coming to join us from Galloway on a train, and we understand the weather is very inclement. Where she hasn't arrived yet. We are hoping that she will arrive. If she does, she will join us. No doubt a little bit frazzled, I expect, from the trip. But if she's not able to join us, we are going to persevere because we have a very distinguished author with us now. And so let me introduce our guest speaker. Professor Kate McLoughlin is an author of varied experience and truly impressive diversity, who rightly prides herself on what she calls writing outside the box academic books. She earned her MA in English Literature from Oxford University, then a diploma in law from the City University in London, her MPhil in Renaissance Literature from the University of Cambridge, and her PhD, her doctorate, from the University of Oxford. And then after several years as a government lawyer, she began teaching English literature, first at the University of Glasgow, and then at Birkbeck College, London, and now at the University of Oxford, where she has been professor of English literature since 2016. But as well as being an accomplished lawyer, a distinguished academic, she's also a very accomplished pianist, an associate of the prestigious Royal College of Music in London. And she's published poetry, including a volume of poetry. She's the author or editor of a number of scholarly books and learned articles in modern literature. But for many of us, she is best known for her important studies of the literature of war and her vital insight that accounts of war are always authored, meaning that they're always rhetorical, they're always discursive, they're always ideological, they're always literary. These works in the literature of war include Martha Gellhorn, The War Writer in the Field and Text, 2007, Authoring War, The Literary Representation of War from the Iliad to Iraq, 2011, and Veteran Politics, British Literature in the Age of Mass Warfare, 1790 to 2015. And she's also edited 5 major volumes on war and literature. And then recently, with the support of a prestigious Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship, recently she turned from the literature of war to the theme of silence. And she's now writing a literary history of silence from the Anglo-Saxon poets to the present. She's also editing an anthology of poems about and evoking silence. So it's my great pleasure now just to invite Kate to reflect a little bit more on her current research, her writing, relating to war and also to the new project on silence. Kate.
Thank you, Jay. That's a very generous introduction. And thank you all very much for coming on this almost snowy day here in beautiful Edinburgh. I'm sorry that I'm not Sara Maitland, who I'm a great fan of, and I'm hoping that she does eventually make it in time for this session. What I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, is invite you all to participate in creating a couple of minutes silence just now in the hall before I begin my reflection. So I'd like us all just to think or imagine that we're contributing to making something, making a positive silence, not just not speaking, but creating a silence. And I'll time it on my phone. And thank you for collaborating on that. So I was asked to reflect a little on my route into working on silence. As Jay says, I'm writing a literary history of silence that goes from the medieval period to the present. And my route probably seems counterintuitive because, as Jay said, I came to it through war writing. My last book, Veteran Poetics, published by Cambridge in 2018, looked at how writers explore questions relating to modernity through the figure of the war veteran. So I was looking at writers from William Wordsworth to J.K. Rowling, who, writing as Robert Galbraith, has created a veteran war detective in the figure of Cormoran Strike. And I looked at how these writers explored questions such as, do we remain the same over time? Looking at veterans who've gone away to war, perhaps spent years away and come back home. They are clearly in some sense the same person, but in other senses they're clearly not. So what does that say about whether we remain the same over time? Another question, what does our reaction to strangers tell us about our values as a society? So when a war veteran comes home very different, very shaped by his or her experiences, maybe traumatized, appearing in some ways very much as a stranger, what does our reaction tell us about how we relate to strangers in our society? What resources do we draw on when we solve problems? So for this, I was looking at veteran detectives. Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories is a veteran of the wars in Afghanistan, and he has a very different approach to problem solving than Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes uses forensic scientific methodology, and Dr. Watson depends on hunches and feelings and noticing things about people. It's a different approach to problem solving. And another question, can we pass on the wisdom of experience? There's a sense in which mass warfare, which really begins with the Napoleonic Wars, mass industrialized warfare, really destroys our ability to describe what it was like and so pass on the benefits of experience. And in the penultimate chapter, I looked at literary war veterans who won't shut up about the wars they've been in. Examples are Uncle Toby in Lawrence Stern's novel Tristram Shandy, or Uncle Albert in the BBC comedy Only Fools and Horses. I don't know if you remember him. Whenever he would always say during the war, and his listeners' eyes would glaze over, and it was, oh no, not another war story from Uncle Albert. And it's always uncles for some reason, who are these boring veteran storytellers. And I interpreted this over-talking, this repetition, as a kind of failure in communication characteristic of modernity. But the last chapter of Veteran Poetics was about the complete opposite, literary war veterans who don't talk about the wars they've been in, who can't or won't talk about them, who are silent. And I interpreted this too as a failure in communication, a failure in the age-old ability to pass on the wisdom of experience. And it was when I was thinking about silent war veterans that a light bulb went on. And I realized that silences are everywhere in English literature, but make up a largely uncharted territory. Sara Maitland is one of the few people who have thought about silences in this way, and she's been a great inspiration to me. So very early on in my thinking, I did a knowledge exchange fellowship with the Oxford Quaker meeting. And I went along to their meetings, and in return, in exchange, this was the exchange part of the fellowship, I put on a series of poetry workshops. And I learnt a huge amount from the members of the Quaker meeting, who are expert practitioners in silence. As you probably know, Quaker meetings take place in complete silence unless somebody is moved to minister or speak. And they might stand up and speak, and then nobody might say anything for another 20 minutes. So I learnt a lot about silence and spirituality from people who thought about it very deeply. And putting on the poetry workshops, I also realised that poetic silence was an even greater resource than I previously thought. So helped by a research fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust, which wonderfully relieves me for 3 years from all teaching and administrative duties, I'm writing a literary history of silence that stretches from an Anglo-Saxon poem in which the protagonist notices a silent region of his mind, to 21st century authors' attempts to carve out silences in the age of digital notifications. And my aim in this history is twofold. First, I want to trace the literary, philosophical, religious, cultural lineages of the various silences. Now, you might think, can silence have a history? Or can it have a philosophical bearing on it? Well, yes, it can, if that's something like classical Stoicism or Christian patience or the Germanic warrior code, for example. And secondly, I want to try to convey the experience of such silences, what they feel like, what they sound like, their mood boards. And that means I'm trying to find a lot of I'm sort of experimenting with vocabulary to describe silences. It's almost a bit like being a restaurant critic describing the same old spaghetti bolognese. Can you find a different way to describe silence? So my history takes in the hushed intimacy of medieval lullabies, exalted states of blissful union with the divine, known as theosis, the tongue-tied lovers of the Renaissance, spellbinding silent scenes in Shakespeare, encrypted expressions of same-sex love, reason-based reticence from the scientific revolution, the romantic sublime, the surprising silences of the garrulous realist novel. You wouldn't think there would be much silence in those 19th century blockbusters, but it's surprising how much there is. The great epics of inarticulable grief, wordless communings with nature, experimental modernist silence, the failure of words in the face of 2 world wars, and the lost voices of those censored and marginalised throughout history. So what I thought I'd do this afternoon is, with our focus on silence, writing and religion, I thought I'd pick out some of the related highlights from what I've discovered so far in my researches. So I'm planning to talk about 3 poems across 4 centuries. Now, Jay, I can go straight into that now, or maybe we can talk a little about what I've already said, or even invite questions, whatever you'd like to do.
I'd like to go into the poems,
Okay,
actually. I think that
great.
might be nice.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. So let's begin with a lullaby. Lullay, lullo, lully, lullay. Buey, buey, lully, lully. Buey, lully, lullo, lully. Lullay, bore, bore, my Bana. Sleep softly now. One can imagine the child's eyelids beginning to droop, their breathing slowing, the mother's voice trailing into silence as she cradles her slumbering infant. This is a silence that is soft, intimate, and soothing. It's an atavistic silence that mothers have fostered across the world since time immemorial. Sara Maitland writes magically about it in her Book of Silence, where she points out that a mother suckling a child is one of the oldest and most enduring images of silence in Western culture. But in the 15th century lyric that I've just read out, it's also a silence of religious significance, as the tiny helpless infant is an object of devotion, Christ at his most vulnerably human. Now, though lullaby singing was undoubtedly a practice in medieval times, the 20 or so lullabies that remain to us in Middle English literature are not remnants of those actually sung by real mothers to real babies, but written lyrics, often the work of Franciscan friars. St. Francis's legacy was to temper the austerity of Christianity by appealing to tender emotion and personal love for Christ, and involving pity for his sorrow in the cradle and his suffering on the cross. So picturing Christ as a baby, weak and dependent on his mother, is very much in this tradition. And for Franciscans, silence, both inner and outer, is critically important in the search for God. St. Bonaventure's 13th century life of Francis describes him seeking out hidden solitude where he might, quote, hearken in loneliness and silence unto the hid treasures of the divine converse. What I think St. Bonaventure is talking about there is the notion of theosis, the idea of contemplation so deep that one approaches the divine. So the medieval lullaby, then, is not only a lyric hushing a baby to sleep, or a lyric about someone hushing a baby to sleep, but the expression, a very simple expression, of a particular theological and spiritual tradition. So I now want to hop forward 2 centuries so that we can sample a poem by the writer Thomas Traherne. Traherne was born in 1636 in the royalist city of Hereford and educated at the Puritan stronghold of Brasenose College, Oxford. He went on to be Anglican rector of the rural Herefordshire parish of Creedon Hill for a quarter of a century. Now, Traherne had a love-hate relationship with silence. Sometimes it absolutely terrified him. He wrote about one lowering and sad evening when all things were dead and quiet, and he found himself out alone in a field. And here's his description of what happened. A certain want and horror fell upon me beyond imagination. The unprofitableness and silence of the place dissatisfied me. Its wideness terrified me. From the utmost ends of the earth, fears surrounded me. How did I know but dangers might suddenly arise from the east and invade me from the unknown regions beyond the seas? So silence here is a reminder of absence. It's a kind of abyss without end. You can feel Traherne's horror when out in the fields at night, he suddenly wondered what monsters might attack him out of the darkness. But on another occasion when he was outdoors, Traherne had a completely different experience of silence. And he wrote, "When I came into the country, and being seated among silent trees, had all my time in mine own hands, I resolved to spend it all, whatever it cost me, in the search of happiness, and to satiate that burning thirst which nature had enkindled in me from my youth." So this time, the experience of silence in nature is the inspiration for a lifelong pursuit of happiness, or felicity, as Traherne tended to call it. Now, Traherne wrote a poem called Silence, which expresses the interrelations between silence, appreciation of God's creation, and happiness. Silence is too long to read out, so I'm going to briefly summarize it. It begins with the argument that inward work is greater than any amount of external good work, such as church building, giving to the poor, visiting the sick, teaching the ignorant, or prostrating oneself in ashes. And this is because all those things have only become necessary because of the fall of man. Now, inward work, when somebody's doing inward work, you might think that they're being idle because it looks from the outside as though they're doing nothing. But Traherne says that simply to see, approve, take pleasure and rejoice within is holier than any do-gooding. Now, this idea looks back to the biblical distinction between Martha and Mary of Bethany, the sisters of Lazarus, in Luke chapter 10. You'll remember that Jesus visited their home, and while Mary sat at his feet listening to him, Martha was distracted with getting the food ready. And Jesus commended Mary's way, the vita contemplativa, or the contemplative life, over Martha's, the vita activa, or the active life. So the speaker of Traherne's poem Silence recounts his own vita contemplativa and describes how it led him to an ecstatic union with God. So let me read you the lines in which he describes this. He, that is God, was an ocean of delights, from whom the living springs and golden streams did come. My bosom was an ocean into which they all did run, and me they did enrich. A vast and infinite capacity did make my bosom like the deity, in whose mysterious and celestial mind all ages and all worlds together shined, who though he nothing said, did always reign, and in himself eternity contain. So this is the height of blissfulness in which God, containing all eternity, suffuses the speaker. So silence then, in the form of contemplation or inward work, is Traherne's key to spiritual joy. So my third and final poem is an exquisite winter poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Frost at Midnight, written in 1798, which I'm sure many of you will know. So the scene is a cottage, it's late at night, and the speaker is indoors, keeping warm by the fire. Might have been a day like today, actually. Beside him, his infant son sleeps in a cradle, and Coleridge's firstborn son, Hartley, was 17 months old when his father wrote the poem. As I mentioned with the lullaby, the mother and child is an image of ancient standing via which to achieve oneness with the divine through silent contemplation. The father-son relationship in Frost at Midnight draws on the same qualities of profound parental intimacy, but I think nods to Coleridge's sometime Unitarianism, a dissenting tradition which believes that Jesus is human rather than divine, and so celebrates Joseph, his human father. In Coleridge's poem, father and sleeping son are in a setting not just silent, but so profoundly silent that it is becoming too difficult to think. 'Tis calm indeed, so calm that it disturbs and vexes meditation with its strange and extreme silentness. Coleridge intensifies this extreme silence with very quiet sounds, a filmy flake of soot fluttering on the grate, and the child's gentle breathings. The faint flappings and flickerings and the sleeping infant's tiny exhalations suggest the speaker is in a state of profound awareness. The poem expresses the father's hopes that the toddler will grow up to be an even better reader of nature than he is himself, seeing and hearing, quote, the lovely shapes and sounds of the eternal knowledge through which God reveals himself. These shapes and sounds occur at all times of year, so Coleridge takes us through the seasons, pointing them out. The greenness clothing the earth in summer, the robin who sits and sings between tufts of snow in winter. The final 5 lines of the poem are entirely devoted to the drops of water which drip from the overhanging edges of the cottage's thatched roof. When he comes to adulthood, the speaker's son will find nature sweet, whether, quote, the eavesdrops fall heard only in the trances of the blast, or if the secret ministry of frost shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon. So this is a very detailed silence, to me a magical silence. The drops falling from the eaves may fall unheard by the physical ear, save during lulls in the wind, or they may harden and sharpen to one of nature's finest points, icicles. Through these silent sounds, these natural lenses, the speaker's son may one day hear and see the divine. So to conclude, I hope that this very brief tour across 4 centuries of poetry reveals the great variety of silences in spiritual lives, Franciscan contemplation of Christ's humanity, the blisses of the vita contemplativa, and the sense of God's silent presence in nature. And this, I think, is just to scratch the surface of silence, religion, and writing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And for the beautiful poems as well, for sharing those with us. What you were saying reminds me a bit of what we were talking about just before this session, and that is we had a very splendid series of Gifford lectures about 9 years ago by Dermot McCulloch, who explored the theme of silence in the history of Christianity, and the different kinds of silence that were captured, that do appear in the history of Christianity, the silence of silent prayer, the silence of contemplation, but also the silence of the church itself in the face sometimes of injustice or cruelty, sexual abuse of children, or slavery, the Holocaust in Germany. So there are many different kinds of silence, and you were reminding us of the vital importance of the silence of contemplation. It brings to mind a little fragment that just stuck in the back of my mind for some reason. A little bit from Bret Harte's, the opening of his poem Legend. As silent as a mirror is believed, realities plunge in silence by. I was wondering, though, one of the things that really impresses me about your writing, Kate, is the breadth of material that you draw upon in an era in which academic life is increasingly specialized, and we're always encouraged to focus on a particular period. You have the courage, and I would say courage, to range broadly from the Iliad to the Iraq War, or in your writings, and to deal with and to approach, say, the history of literature and war in a thematic way, but to draw upon a vast body of literature. And it does take courage, because it means that you're moving into other people's area of specialization. But I was wondering if you could comment a bit about how it is that you approach your research in order to draw so widely. And when you envisage a project, many of us will be very focused on the research, and we'll try to master all of the material. But you have to range much more broadly and widely. How is it that you conduct your research?
Well, that's a fascinating question, Jay, because it draws attention to obvious silences. Because I work on such a big canvas, inevitably coverage can't be exhaustive. So I have to think a lot about what I'm going to leave out as well as what I'm going to include. So if you like, silences punctuate my work. And I have to say, when I describe my work to people, whether it's war writing or silence, the inevitable response is, oh, have you thought of this? And inevitably I haven't. And but I at least take comfort in the idea that it seems to get a response of making people think of their own examples, which is brilliant. The approach involves a lot of reading. And I guess I'm lucky in that that's really my favourite thing to do, and I'm lucky that I get paid to do it. So a lot of time in libraries, a lot of time reading, and a sense, so I'm actually sort of working through English literature chronologically, and it's only British literature, so it could be much, much faster. but there's no way I could take on other traditions. So writing the literary history of silence has felt like doing an English degree again. I did my first degree at Oxford, where the course is very historically based, and it's sort of from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf and a bit further on. It's been like doing that again, and I'm lucky because I loved doing my undergraduate degree, so it's a great joy to revisit all that territory.
You commented a bit on how you moved from this work on, it's been years that you've been working on the literature of war, and 3 major books, 5 major edited volumes, scores of learned articles. But I wondered, you mentioned the silence of war veterans. Was one of the things that Sara Maitland talks about is moving away from a very noisy life to recover a sense of herself in silence. And do you come across any of this in war experiences in your writing of soldiers speaking of moments of silence or times of silence in the midst of all the noise of war that somehow helps them to recapture their humanity?
Yes, I do. I think war is punctuated, obviously, by lulls. I mean, we're talking about conventional battle, I suppose, here. And there can be periods of great noise and action, and then there can be periods of boredom and quietness. And one of the writers, I think, who's most brilliant at capturing that combat soundscape is Ford Madox Ford, who wrote brilliantly of the sounds made by ordnance, but also of the quieter times. So having started with the Anglo-Saxons, I'm now up to the beginning of the 20th century with my researches on the literary history of silence, and I'm going to have a chapter on the world wars. And one of the things I want to think about is that kind of soundscape where you find silence in moments of armed combat, but also relating to what you were saying about the silence of the church, theoretical questions about how can we describe the indescribable. So what Theodor Adorno said about writing poetry after Auschwitz being barbaric, where does that leave us in terms of written representation or artistic or creative responses? Yeah.
I wonder if we might open things up to the audience. Did we have any questions? We have a roving mic, I believe. And we have a question here.
So, hi, Kate. So thank you very much for coming today in this. And I loved the way you started at the beginning with inviting us to do that silence. I think that is a good counter to us talking so much about silence now in the piece, in the session. I just wanted to ask about really from the work on veterans as well. And you mentioned the various people that you work. I don't know your work very well, but I wondered, do you ever look at it from a gendered perspective as well? Are we yet far enough along to see differences or viewpoints that would be different from women who've been involved in combat?
Yes, that's a fascinating question, and I could probably talk all day about it. I think silences are extremely gendered, and starting from medieval times, actually starting from classical times, there's a sense of expectations being that silence goes with modesty and chastity on the part of women, and that women who talk or talk too much or even talk are described as scolds or gossips or fishwives or etc., etc. So there's this sense that a woman's place is to be silent, and that has biblical authority as well. Most famously, in I think it's St. Paul says that women shouldn't preach. But fascinatingly, there's also a sort of a masculine version of silence which comes from, I guess, classical Stoicism, but it's also to do with the Germanic warrior code, which is that it's manly to put up with things and not complain. So keeping silent from that point of view is an expression of masculinity more than femininity. It's seen as a form of strength, whereas women's silence is seen more as a sort of kind of feminine duty. I think as more recently, I don't know if you know, there's an amazing book by Tilly Olson called Silences, which was a very influential text in second wave feminism. And it detailed all the ways in which women, other minorities as well, but mainly women, have been prevented from writing, whether they've been gaslighted or just had too much domestic work to do, or suffered from imposter syndrome, or have had their work plagiarized. She details the kind of external barriers to women expressing themselves in published writing. And I think that led to certain other traits. I mean, it's a bit like what Virginia Woolf's talking about in A Room of One's Own, the external barriers to women writing, and the sort of psychological inhibitions as well. And there've been sort of two theoretical reactions to that. One has been to celebrate the other ways in which women express themselves, so looking at non-verbal kinds of creativity, for example, like tapestry or quilt making or gardening. So I'm thinking of, I've forgotten her name, but In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. So to find non-verbal ways that women have expressed themselves, Alice Walker. And the other critical reaction has been to find strength in women's silences, to see them as a form of power, as I think silences can be, so an actual form of resistance. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot to say about gender and silences. So thank you.
Silence in the poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, particularly how he sort of described silence as vexing, so vexing that you couldn't even meditate. And I was just wondering, in terms of presence and absence in that poem, if silence is the absence of sound, whether it be the sound of talking or the sound of things, what would it be the presence of?
Yeah. So thank you for that. I think you've put your finger on a really important point, which is, first of all, how we define silence. And there are lots of definitions. I think the dictionary definitions start with the absence of sound, but you can also think of silence as the absence of language or the absence of voices. Other people, and Sara Maitland's one of them, and I'm one of them, prefer to think of silence as a positive thing rather than an absence. And that's why when I invited you to hold a silence at the beginning, I suggested we think of it as creating a silence, so making a silence, that it's something we make together. It's not something that that's kind of left there when we refrain from speaking. I think that Coleridge's poem is fascinating because he seems to get so deeply into silence. He seems to go beyond a kind of, there's a silence where, as you quote, meditation's difficult, but he seems to go beyond that. So it turns into if you like, an inward silence as much as an external silence. This might sound a bit paradoxical, but I think even when things are quite noisy going on in the place where you are, you can be so inwardly focused that you don't hear anything except what you're focusing on. And I think it's that very, very deep, the extreme silentness, as he calls it, that he's trying to get at. And for him, those were the moments when he most saw the divine in creation. What I love about Coleridge is he finds all these natural prisms and lenses in nature. So there's a beautiful poem called This Lime Tree Bower My Prison, when Charles Lamb came to visit him, and they were meant to go walking in the Quantocks in Somerset. But Coleridge's wife Sarah spilt a skillet of boiling milk on his foot, so he couldn't go out. So the others went out for the walk, and he sat in a lime tree bower in the garden and wrote this beautiful poem in which he looks through a sort of translucent lime leaf. It's sort of glowing green in the sun, and that it's through a lens like that he might see God. Or in Frost at Midnight, he talks about an icicle. It's another kind of lens. Or in the Aeolian Harp, he imagines he's looking at the sea and he sees the sparkles on the sea, and he half focuses and half unfocuses his eyes. That's another sort of natural lens. So it's in these sort of moments when he thinks he can glimpse the divine that this is where silence really, this deep inward silence really helps him get to the moment and get him into the zone, as you might say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kate. I'm wondering, have you thought, or will you be working on theatrical silences? And I was thinking, for example, in Measure for Measure, and the silence at the end, and the ambiguity of the silence on stage.
Yes, absolutely. So I have got a chapter on Shakespeare's silences, and I've tried to vary that so as to show the incredible sort of intellectual and philosophical range informing Shakespeare's silences. There are so many. So you mentioned the silence in Measure for Measure when the Duke basically tells Isabella that he's going to marry her. And not only does he not ask her, but Shakespeare doesn't give her the right to reply. She's just silent on the stage for the rest of it. But there are so many women, to go back to the previous question, in Shakespeare who are on stage not saying anything for a very long time. So Juliet has to lie there in a drugged sleep, for example. But there are many examples of that. One of the silences that I think is most spellbinding in Shakespeare is at the end. It's very appropriate for this. It's the end of The Winter's Tale, and it's Hermione who is pretending to be a statue, and she has to be on stage. And Leontes, her husband, who cast her off and falsely accused her of adultery, and thinks she's been dead these 30 years, is brought into the vicinity and looks at the statue, and then the statue slowly moves. And it's a wonderful moment in Shakespeare, and everybody around, including Leontes, is absolutely speechless in wonder at the sight of this statue coming to life. So I was interested really what that felt like. So I spent a lot of time reading reviews of The Winter's Tale, going back as far as I could, and also reading accounts by actresses of what it's like to play Hermione and have to be that still in silence for that amount of time. And it's quite fascinating, the tricks of the trade that emerge. So if you hold an attitude like this and you've got your fingers out like that, it's very hard to keep them still. So it's much easier if you can rest on a pillar, which quite a lot of them do, or if you've got folds and you can put your hand amongst the folds of your gowns. There's lots of tricks to keeping this absolute stillness. Because, of course, everyone in the audience has got their, theatre binoculars absolutely trained on you to see if you're moving at all. And what I found was the reactions of the audiences were absolutely transfixed. And so it seems to me that silence, protracted silence on stage, can be one of the most profound theatrical experiences.
all you said. I was really interested in what you were saying about your work with the Quakers and exploring silence in Quaker worship. I was wondering if you'd explored silence within other liturgical traditions. I was thinking particularly of the silence within Taizé worship, where silence effectively takes the place of the sermon.
That's really interesting, yes. So what I've written about so far are the kind of medieval religious silences. So I talk about medieval lullabies, and I also talk about theosis, this becoming one with God, and apophaticism, which is the idea that God can't be described, but except in the negative. So you can only say what God is not, but then he's not that either, because you can only say what he is not. So that's a very interesting, the via negativa is a very interesting tradition. I also write about, in addition to Thomas Traherne, who was an Anglican, I write about 17th century or 16th and 17th century Catholic writers who, recusants, who were forced into silence by actual laws that were passed, who couldn't confess their faiths. And so how they wrote about non-verbal things like tears. So, for example, the tears of St. Peter, which, for English Catholics in the 16th century very much sort of symbolised the sense of the tears of someone who had betrayed Christ, and it reflected their sort of ambiguous position. Liturgically, not so much, because I've been concentrating on literature. But as I get further along, so my next chapter is going to be about modernist writers, and I'm very interested in the influence of Buddhism on T.S. Eliot, because, I hardly know anything about it yet. I've got a lot of research to do, but I think silence is hugely important in the Buddhist tradition.
Thank you very much. In some ways, you've begun to set out your approach as regards women, but I wondered how far that also worked for other peoples who have been silenced. So you talk about Beowulf to Virginia Woolf and a bit further on. Are you including literature of the late 20th, early 21st century, where we've seen an explosion of people writing from a minority perspective? And do you even go back, does somebody like Oluda Equiano, for example, and his memoirs, discussed either as memoirs or a fictitious account of his life, does that come in, and how far might you be including that kind of literature?
So thank you for that question. Yes, it does. Originally, I had planned a final chapter called Lost Voices, when I wanted to reflect on those who've been silenced and censored and repressed throughout literary history, which would include not only women, but members of BAME communities and LGBTQIA+ communities. I've since realised that that's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to do it as I go along. So that's what I'm trying to do. I think it raises a really interesting theoretical critical question, and one that I haven't quite worked out my own response to yet. And it really comes from Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? For those of you who don't know, I'm sure many of you do, but this is an essay about the subaltern class in India, particularly lower class women who through history have been denied a voice. And Spivak suggests that what we don't need to do is well, I say we, a critic in my position, it's not appropriate to try and speak for such people, and nor is it appropriate to try to give them a voice, because that just perpetuates the system that silenced them in the first place. But Spivak doesn't suggest what then a critic like me can do, except, I think, to somehow curate or honour these silences. And that seems to me to be an honourable intention, but I haven't yet worked out what it would look like as a critical methodology. So it would mean drawing attention to silences and letting them stand without trying to explicate them or interpret them. And this seems to me to be an area which is at sort of it's one of the hot topics at the moment in literary theory and cultural theory. And I think various people around the world are working on it. I don't think I'm going to be the person who works out what the critical approach would be like, but I certainly want to discuss it.
I was wondering if we could just draw on what you were mentioning then, if you'd perhaps thought of making a comparison to Rebecca S. Chopp's discourse on trauma theory. She goes for the poetics of, I think it is the poetics of trauma, actually, and how, poetics of testimony, that was it, and how you bear testimony to concepts like trauma, as opposed to actually exploring them from a critical perspective, bearing them as testimony instead.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant analogy. Yes, absolutely. It would be a question of bearing witness, and the question then is, what does that look like in practice? What does it look like critically? And I think that's an ongoing discussion at the moment. So when I finish this literary history, it's pitched really as a crossover trade academic book. And it's going to be published by Oxford University Press. But then I would like to do a critical volume exploring these more theoretical issues, which I think are fascinating.
If I might come in again, do you think, Kate, that many people fear silence? When Sara Maitland said when she left her noisy life behind, trying to find herself through silence, many people thought there was something wrong with her. And many people feel that, well, if someone who's going to move towards a silent life, that there's something unhealthy about that. Do you think that that's the case? I suppose we're very social creatures as yes, human beings. Yes. And it seems that many people really fear silence.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it can be for a number of reasons, and a lot has to do with being left alone with your own thoughts. I mean, like Hamlet says, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. So when we're on our own, in silence, then that's when the worrying thoughts come. I read a brilliant book by Susan Cain called Quiet. Susan Cain is someone who is an American lawyer who discovered or knew all along that she hated the argy-bargy of legal life. And she started to think about the power of introversion. It's an odd thing to admit to on a stage in front of an audience of people, but I think I am a high reactive introvert. So I like silence, I like libraries, and I like working on my book in my study. Other people could think of no worse hell, I'm sure. So it's very much, your genes, how you're conditioned, and obviously not for everyone. There is a program called Viparassa, where you go into silence for 10 days, 10 hours a day for 10 days. And the meditation is so detailed that you have to meditate on each of your eyelashes. And I'm not quite brave enough to try that. I think that might be a bit too much.
Well, I think we're drawing near to a close. It falls to me to, well, one, to say I'm very sorry that Sara Maitland was not able to join us. We do hope that she's okay, and it's simply been a delay with the train, which wouldn't surprise me at all given the conditions of the weather and trying to get here from Galloway. But we have missed her. But we've had quite a treat in Kate McLoughlin, and she's given us a wonderful view, both of her work on the literature of war and of her new project on the literature of silence and how these two relate. She is a fine scholar, but she's also an artist with words and someone who treats the literature of scholarship very seriously. So thank you for making this such an entertaining, fascinating hour, and thank you to the audience for your very thoughtful questions as well.